Well, thank you for all coming out to a Creation Conference. These are pretty exciting events, I'd say. Now, as Gary was saying, I do come from this country originally. Well, another reason not mentioned, but we've actually got two little granddaughters living in Florida as well. My wife is actually American. I'm Australian, my wife's American, so we've got two granddaughters in Florida. Now, I'm a PhD scientist, so don't let anyone tell you there aren't any scientists who believe the Bible, because I certainly am one. I did a lot of work in even superconducting physics that shone laser light at selenium molecules like this, and analyzed the results of the spectrum I was measuring, published in these specialist journals there. So I did do real scientific work, before, and I still do real scientific work, but from a different perspective now, in a sense. Yes, I'm a chess master. That's a little hobby of mine. That's what Gary was talking about. In the Australian conference, I did 12 blindfold games there. And I played with some pretty good people in my time as well. Now, one other thing you might want to know, my name is actually a Hebrew name. It's the Hebrew word for Frenchman. Yeah. So I can tell Jewish jokes and French jokes and get away with it. Now, if you want to know why a Jew like me would believe in Jesus of Nazareth as a Messiah, you could have a look at this special we're offering for this conference. It's my DVD called Jesus in Genesis, and there's another Messianic Jew or Hebrew Christian wrote a book called Messianic Christology. A really fine book, that one, by Dr. Arnold Fruchtenbaum. But of course, nowadays, my area is refuting the theories of this man. And let's face it, he has probably done more to harm people's trust in the Bible than anyone else who's ever lived. And that's why we have our website, creation.com, answering two basic questions. Is creation true, and does it matter? That's what we're hoping to answer at this conference. Now, one thing which is important is, in fact, science itself. We are scientists, a lot of us, but in that case, why does science work at all? See, atheists will use science to attack the Bible, but what they don't seem to realize is they're cutting off the branch they're sitting on, because, in fact, science grew up in a Christian worldview. Now, just from this website, you can get some articles on what I'm going to talk about. There's an article called The Christian Roots, the Biblical Roots of Modern Science. That picture there is of Sir Isaac Newton, the greatest scientist of all time, probably. That's what a lot of people say, I'll tell you, because he discovered the laws of motion, gravity, cooling, invented the reflecting telescope, co-invented calculus, discovered the spectrum of light, which is my area, spectroscopy, but he wrote more about the Bible than he wrote about science. While the many founders of modern science who was a convinced Bible believer, a convinced believer in the Bible's history. And there's a shortcut. We have a lot of shortcuts on our website. This is creation.com/roots. You get to this article quite quickly. Another one called Why Does Science Work at All? Again, creation.com/why science. Very easy to get to these articles. And now you've probably heard of this man, Richard Dawkins, he's one of these notorious people trying to misuse science to attack Christianity. And my book, The Greatest Hoax on Earth, was refuting Dawkins point by point. The last chapter also goes through some of the stuff I'm talking about tonight as well. And of course, one thing that motivates us is that we're supposed to have an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that is in you. Again, this shows the Christian faith is not a blind faith. We are supposed to have reasons for our faith, and we're supposed to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and your mind, and all your strength. So don't forget the mind part. I didn't see a box outside saying, leave your brains in the box, you don't need them inside church. That's not the way it should be. We're supposed to also demolish arguments. So it's not only defending the truth, giving good reasons, we are supposed to give reasons against anti-Christian arguments. And I didn't say demolish the people, I said demolish the arguments that they're using to attack the faith. And we don't stop at just bashing evolution or pushing design. We want to bring people to Christ, by whom all things were made. Now, one book we're doing is, of course, the Creation Answers book, and I think you find even in conferences, most of the questions that get asked are found in the Creation Answers book. 60 questions, 20 different chapters there. And the point is, we've got lots of evidence for our faith, and this is what Dr. Mike Adams said: if Christianity dies in America, it'll not be for a lack of evidence of its truthfulness, it'll be for a lack of dissemination of the evidence. That's a pretty key point. The evidence must be disseminated, because don't count on the media or the schools to do it. It has to be the body of Christ that does it. Now let's get on to what science is supposed to be about. This is a typical chemistry lab and also a bit of a biology lab. It's got a telescope, it's got solutions there. But what's it all about, though? I mean, one thing to understand about science education in the modern world is about specialization, which means you learn more and more about less and less. I mean, think about my own career at university. In the first year, it was mathematics, geology, chemistry, physics. In the second year, no more geology, but concentrating more on the other ones. In the third year, no more mathematics, but really getting deep into the other ones. Fourth year, no more organic chemistry. But you know, if you carry this to its logical conclusion, you end up knowing everything about nothing. That's why it doesn't really worry me about people who want to use science to disprove Christianity. They're usually speaking way outside their own area. And it shows very much in what Dawkins talks about. He's made some really bad blunders in areas outside his area of animal behavior. Now, another thing to distinguish is very important. It's about two different types of science. You see, we've got the real science that put men on the moon and cure diseases, builds all the technology you use, but that's about things that we can test and observe. Like, for instance, water boils at 100 degrees. Well, in this country, it boiled at 212. It's a bit strange. But the point, it's not going to boil at 312 tomorrow. There's something repeatable about science that you can test and repeat. And don't take my word for it. Go and boil some water and put a thermometer and tell me what temperature it boils at. It's quite different from the idea of evolution, though. Evolution is telling us about some things which happened supposedly in history, which we can't observe. Like, for instance, say 300 million years ago, a fish turned into an amphibian. Now, no one ever saw that happen. And even if we turned a fish into an amphibian today, it wouldn't prove it happened 300 million years ago. So evolution is not really about science. It's a claim about history and a claim to try to explain the designs that we observe without a designer. That's the whole motivation of evolutionary ideas. Now, going back to the real science, operational science or observational science, there are certain things that are needed for observational science to work. Well, let's look at a few of those. For one thing, the universe is real. Now, that seems pretty obvious to us, right? But there are some Eastern religions who deny that the universe is real. They'll tell you things like everything is an illusion, but then you should realize if everything is an illusion, that statement is an illusion as well. So you see, a lot of anti-Christian arguments actually end up, again, cutting the branch you're sitting on. They refute themselves. If someone tells you there's no such thing as truth, well, you ask, well, is that true? Well, you can't know anything for certain. Well, how do you know that for certain? Or even people like Richard Dawkins who say that something is not meaningful unless it can be tested by science. Okay, test that statement by science. You see, by its own criteria, it's a meaningless statement. And just as a little, hope you won't mind me, there's a popular worship song which says a God is indescribable and then goes on to describe him. But the Bible tells us that God created the universe. The universe is real. Matter is real. God created it. In fact, at the end of creation week, God said it was very good. So matter in itself is not sinful, not evil, not inferior. I mean, it's not God, of course, but it is actually something God created. And the other thing, a very major thing, is that the universe is orderly. You see, that's why I can tell you water is going to boil at 212. But imagine if Zeus and his gang were in charge. Why would you expect order in a universe under that sort of regime where different gods have their own different domains and can make their own different rules and they're capricious, they could change the rules at any time they wanted to? I mean, the water god might decide to keep water a bit liquid for a bit longer, so it doesn't boil at 212, but 312. You see, you won't get science under that sort of worldview. But the Bible tells us that God is a divine lawmaker. He is the God of order, not the author of confusion. It was this very key belief that was so different from ancient Greece and ancient China, where science got to a certain level, but it really sputtered out. It was stillborn. It didn't actually take off in Greece or China. It only took off in Western Europe when it was basically a Christianized culture, which had this belief of a God of order. This is the key that made the difference, and why Europe became the leader in science. And there are even non-Christian historians, plenty of them, who actually had to grudgingly admit it was this belief in a God of order that was lacking in Greece and China, which is why science just didn't take off in those places. And also we have a key dominion mandate in Genesis 1:27. God has given us the authority to investigate the creation. See, creation is not divine. He's given it to us to investigate, to have dominion. But you see, if the creation is divine, then you have a problem. Well, first of all, if the creation is divine, it could change its mind at any moment, and then you haven't got the order you need. But then would you have to pray to the river god before you boiled water and did that experiment? You see, if creation is divine, science is not possible. It's only possible because we are allowed and been given authority to investigate the creation. And in fact, people like Sir Isaac Newton and Johann Kepler, all these great founders of modern science, they thought they were doing God's work. Kepler said he was thinking God's thoughts after him. They regarded their scientific work as glorifying God and fulfilling this dominion mandate. And it's very interesting to see how some of these historians who may not be Christians have come to the same conclusion. Here's Rodney Stark, who said it wasn't the wisdom of the East that gave rise to science, nor does Zen meditation turn people's hearts against slavery. Instead, what did he tell us? Science was not the work of Western secularists or even deists. It was entirely the work of devout believers in an active, conscious creator God. And there are other authorities like James Hannam, who wrote a book called God's Philosophers, again talking about how the medieval world laid the foundation for science. And he gives us a few things that recent research has shown that the Middle Ages were a period of enormous advances in science, technology, and culture. Now, a lot of the popular media who don't know anything about history call these the Dark Ages, but there was nothing really dark about them. These were very productive times for innovation in science. And he goes on to tell us that quite a lot of these things that happened in the Middle Ages, like the compass, paper, printing, stirrups, gunpowder, appeared in Western Europe. The so-called Dark Ages were times where this sort of thing happened. Goes on to explain that you have the stirrup, which enabled people to ride horses properly. That's a big advantage. You have the heavy plow, which enabled the ground to be much more productive. You had a big advantage in agriculture because of that. There was a population explosion in the Middle Ages because the ground could be made more productive, could support more people because of these inventions. And other things too, mechanical clock, windmill. They had wind power and water power developed very strongly in the Middle Ages. And the blast furnace to make steel. And I see quite a lot of you guys are wearing a Middle Ages, a Dark Ages invention. The spectacles were invented in the 1200s in the monasteries. They did work on optics in those areas. So you see how you guys are benefiting from the science, the forgotten science in the Middle Ages. And some more things that developed out of there. All these machines like lenses and cameras, Industrial Revolution, owe all this to the science in the Middle Ages, which we hardly ever hear about. And even people like Galileo and Newton actually built on the scientists in the Middle Ages. I mean, a man, Buridan in France, invented basically what Newton called the first law of motion. But actually goes back to the Middle Ages. And that's why Newton could say he was standing on the shoulder of giants, which meant these Middle Ages philosophers and scientists. But there's another thing that happened after that. What I've talked about so far might be called mere Christianity. As a general Christian worldview, a great respect for the Bible, Jesus as the Son of God, all these things. C.S. Lewis called it mere Christianity. But see, during the Reformation, there was actually another advance forward, even beyond the great scientists of the Middle Ages. And Peter Harrison, who's an Australian professor of science and religion, he's actually at Oxford University, where Richard Dawkins is, and he said, had it not been for the rise of a literal interpretation of the Bible and subsequent appropriation by early modern scientists, modern science may not have arisen at all. Now, again, this is contrary to what you hear in the media, how the Bible believes are going to hurt science and take us back to the Dark Ages. But in fact, he is telling us that, in fact, it was this plain meaning of the Bible that led to modern science. And he tells us a few more things about it. In sum, the Bible and its literal interpretation have played a vital role in the development of modern science. See, once again, a historian of science stresses the importance of the Bible to develop modern science, quite the opposite of what Richard Dawkins would have us believe. And here's another professor from Canada this time, Stephen Snowbelin, telling us something about, again, a positive relationship between the resurgence of a Hebraic literal exegesis in the Protestant Reformation and the rise of the empirical method in modern science. And he goes on to explain what he's talking about here, because I actually prefer the term plain meaning to literal meaning, because in fact, we know there are different types of literature in the Bible. The Psalms are clearly written as poetry, and so should be understood as poetry. Genesis is clearly written as history, so it should be understood as history. When Jesus said, "I am the door," but you don't go and look for knobs and hinges. So that's what wooden literalism would be. But this is not what we're talking about. This is what we're talking about here, what I would call the grammatical historical approach. What did the Bible mean according to the original readers? Or you might call it a textualist or originalist approach. And this is what we're talking about. Not wooden literalism, but the plain understanding of Scripture as it was written. And the point is, as he goes on to tell us, that this method of understanding the Bible, treating the Bible as an objective text, instead of going on these flights of fancy allegorization, treat the Bible as it is written, and they transferred that view to nature. That's a big difference. You see, the Renaissance was actually, in a sense, a backward step, because what the Renaissance was doing was going back to the times of Aristotle, the Greeks and the Romans, and almost ignoring the great advances in the Middle Ages. So it was a sort of reactionary step. But that meant that you got these ideas of Aristotle becoming the norm, and that was a problem. See, Aristotle said that a heavy object will fall faster than a light object. That's what Aristotle said. But you see, what the scientists would do is say, well, is this what happens? God is sovereign. He can create how he pleases. So the only way you're going to find out, if he hasn't told us in the Bible, is to go and investigate. So first, treat the Bible objectively, then treat nature objectively. How does nature actually behave? And we know that a heavy object and light object will fall at the same acceleration. On the moon especially, when there's no air resistance. Here, of course, we've got air resistance, but on the moon, a lead weight and a feather will drop and hit at the same time. So this is the difference. Real science. Let's see what nature does objectively. And this came from the way they were understanding the Bible, according to these experts. I'm not sure if they're even Christians, but this is what they said. This method of understanding the Bible, this objective understanding that creationists are promoting, was transferred to nature with very big advances. And here's another guy who is definitely not a Christian, Lauren Isley. He said the philosophy of experimental science began with the sheer act of faith that the universe possessed order and could be interpreted by rational minds. And the irony he goes on to note as well is there's a paradox that science, which professionally has little to do with faith, owes its origins to an act of faith, that the universe could be rationally interpreted, and science today is sustained by that assumption. So in fact, what Richard Dawkins is in fact doing is undermining the whole belief system that made science possible. Now let's go on a bit further. Some other assumptions that are required for science, and one is rational thinking. We have the ability to think, to voluntary will we have. And again, God made us in his image. We are supposed to think like God. Jesus is called the Logos. We are supposed to think logically. But if evolution were true, why should we trust our own thoughts to be right? Because our brain is just a rearranged monkey brain. That's all. We're a rearranged pond scum according to evolution. So why should we trust our thoughts to be rational in the first place under the evolutionary philosophy? And C.S. Lewis, the great apologist, he said, if the whole evolution of man was an accident, then our present thoughts are mere accidents, the accidental byproduct of the movement of atoms. And this holds for the thoughts of the materialist as well as for anyone else's. But the problem for that is that if their thoughts of materialism are merely accidental byproducts, why should we trust them to be true? I see that no reason that one accident should be able to give me the correct account of all the other accidents. So here's a key area where atheistic evolution shoots itself in the foot. They've got no basis for their own rationality. They might call themselves rationalists, but under their own philosophy, rationality has no meaning because natural selection would select for survival value, not for truth or logic. Or they might call themselves free thinkers, but under their philosophy, their thoughts are the results of atoms in the brain obeying the fixed laws of chemistry. So they can't be free thinkers. They can't help what they think. It just follows from the laws of chemistry. So you see, once again, evolution doesn't give any basis for rational thought or for science in the first place. Now, one last thing I'd like to mention is science requires objective and honest reporting. You see, I can't do everything. Everything that I did in my science work was building on previous work. So I had to trust to some extent that it was reported honestly. And again, we have that in the Bible. God tells us not to lie, not to bear false witness. Jesus is called the way, the truth, and the life. He said, the truth shall set you free. But if evolution is true, why should we tell the truth? See, here are a couple of evolutionists. Jaron Lanier said there's a lot of people uncomfortable with accepting evolution because it leads to what they perceive as a moral vacuum in which their best impulses have no basis in nature. And Richard Dawkins says that's just tough. We have to face up to the truth. So here's the world champion evolutionist Richard Dawkins saying if evolution is true, there's no ultimate basis for right and wrong. So why should we tell the truth under an evolutionary philosophy? So is it any wonder that there's a huge epidemic of fraud in science? And Jerry Bergman, who's got several earned doctorates, he wrote an article in our Journal of Creation. It's available on our website. It's called Why the Epidemic of Fraud Exists in Science Today. And he cites a lot of secular journals admitting the problem. Like Discover magazine saying that fraud is now a serious, deeply rooted problem. And even Nature, probably the leading science journal in the world, that documents the fraud even in the leading universities like Cornell, Harvard, and Yale. Now, what I've got on the right-hand side are the banners of Harvard and Yale, because they were both founded by Christians. Because you've got the Urim and Thummim in the Bible. That's what the Hebrew means. And looks at veritas means light and truth. The founders wanted to use these universities to teach the truth and to glorify God as creator. Unfortunately, now these universities are founts of anti-Christian bigotry. They have hate speech against Christians, basically. They've gone the totally opposite of what they were founded to produce. And this shows they've lost the Christian roots, so guess what happens? Then they're surprised at the fraud that occurs because they've actually undermined the reason we should tell the truth. But where did the lying and sin come from? The Bible tells us very clearly it came from our forefather Adam, the ancestor of all humanity, the first man Adam. And in fact, this belief in Adam's fall turned out to produce another great leap forward in science. I showed you how science flourished first in the Middle Ages under mere Christianity, developed even further when they recovered the plain meaning of the scriptures, and they actually went further still because of this belief in Adam's fall. And this is in the 17th century, and this is Peter Harrison again. He's written a book called The Fall of Man and the Foundations of Science. And the point is, people like Francis Bacon, extremely influential philosopher in science, he was trying to recapture the knowledge Adam had before the fall. See, they believed that the fall not only affected our morality, but also affected our intellect. We don't think as clearly as Adam did before the fall. And see, what the science was trying to do was to recover some of that. Determine whether the human mind might by any means be restored to its perfect and original condition, or if that may not be, reduced to a better condition than that in which it now is. So you see the key thing here. They had to believe in a literal Adam and a literal fall, as the book of Genesis teaches and the New Testament affirms. This would not work without a literal understanding of the creation account and fall account in Genesis. And see, this belief led to another big advance in science over what had been before. And yet, again, the secular media would paint us, the creationists, as being anti-science. Yet, in fact, it's yet another creationist belief system, the literal fall of Adam, that advanced modern science in history. And it's what Peter Harrison tells us. For many champions of new learning in the 17th century, the encyclopedic knowledge of Adam was a benchmark in which their own aspirations were gauged. And even more, he goes on to credit Augustinian views about the limitations of human knowledge in the wake of the fall, and thus experimental science can claim a filial, which means a father-son relationship, with the tradition of Augustinian, the idea, the great teacher of the church who taught about the effects of the fall. One of the greatest minds who has ever lived, whether in the church or outside of the church. And Peter Harrison says, in fact, science, experimental science, owes a lot to his teachings of the fall, as per these 17th century giants of science like Francis Bacon. So what can the atheists say about this? Well, they may say, well, we can cut the apron strings now. But then I want to quote something from Margaret Thatcher, probably the greatest British Prime Minister of the last half century. And she said in an address to the Church of Scotland, if you try to take the fruits of Christianity without the roots, the fruits will wither. And they will not come again unless you nurture the roots. The fruits have withered, and so, which is why we've got all these cases of fraud, and why science has also been terribly abused to make, for abortion and this immoral embryonic stem cell research, all these nasty anti-human, human-destroying methods of science. It's been removed from its Christian foundation with disastrous effects. But another word of caution she made is that we must not profess the Christian faith and go to church because we want social reforms or benefits or a better sustainable behavior, but because we accept the sanctity of life, the responsibility that comes with freedom and the supreme sacrifice of Christ. So pretty important how what our motivation should be as well. Now, I also want to talk about some myths about science. I hope I've shown you the important Christian roots of science, the basic Christian worldview, and the importance of a plain meaning of the Bible transferring to a plain meaning of nature, and the recovery of pre-fall knowledge that Adam had as being vital for the development of science in history and logically. But there's some terrible myths about science that have been taught, which also must be addressed. Now, one terrible myth is somehow, creation is religion, evolution is science. And evolutionists are the epitome of objectivity, while creationists are biased. Well, let's have a look at some of these people here. Here is Thomas Nagel, a philosopher, who said, I want atheism to be true. Admitting that there are intelligent religious believers. But he said, I don't want to believe in a God. I don't want there to be a universe like that. That's a belief system. That's a blind faith, but he is angry at God. He doesn't want there to be a God. Not that he concluded from rational thought that that atheism is true. He just doesn't want to be accountable. Quite an admission there. And here's another one. See, Lawrence Krauss was talking with Richard Dawkins basically a love fest between two staunch atheists. And again, he said he is an anti-theist. Maybe I can't prove there's no God, but I wouldn't want to live in a universe like that. That was only this year. So pretty recent material there. But again, the bias is very clear. These guys are going to fight creation and push evolution no matter what because they don't want to be accountable to their maker. And here's an older quote here. Lewontin said, "We take the side of science in spite of the patent absurdity of some of its constructs, in spite of the failure to fulfill many of its extravagant promises, in spite of a tolerance for just so stories, because we have a prior commitment to materialism." And materialism means matter is all there is, because we cannot allow a divine foot in the door. So no matter how absurd the theories are, he's not going to admit a designer. And here's another one, Michael Ruse. You might remember 30 years ago, he was one of the key atheist witnesses at the Arkansas creation trial. He was the philosopher who said that creation is religion, evolution, science. But later on, he had to admit, evolution really is an ideology, a secular religion, a full-fledged alternative to Christianity with meaning and morality. Evolution is a religion. That was true of evolution in the beginning. It's true of evolution still today, an explicit substitute for Christianity. So when the ACLU talk about getting religion out of the public schools, no, they haven't. They've just got rid of Christianity and replaced it with this religion instead. What their own lead witness admits is a religion. And Dawkins as well. He said Darwin made it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. He has his bias there. He's an atheist, and Darwin has made it possible for his atheistic faith. It's a crutch. Evolution is a crutch for the atheistic faith. But I hope as the conference advances, we will show that this crutch is really a broken reed they're standing on. Now, conversely, here's the other side of the coin. I've shown you that the atheists have their bias, and some of these guys are quite candid about their bias. But here is Mark Kirshner from Harvard. Now, people will tell you that evolution is incredibly essential for science, but here he's saying that almost all of biology has proceeded independent of evolution, except evolutionary biology itself. Well, what a surprise, okay? In molecular biology, biochemistry, and physiology have not taken evolution into account at all. So much for evolution being a foundation for biology. It really has not had any use whatsoever. I mean, even medicine, you think of things like vaccination and anesthetics, antiseptics. The antiseptics are based on the germ theory discovered by the creationist Louis Pasteur, who refuted spontaneous generation, which is still the belief of evolution today, that life came from non-living chemicals. Pasteur showed it didn't happen. So real medicine is based on creationists like those guys. And even antibiotics. One of the people who won the Nobel Prize for antibiotics was Ernst Chain, who was an Orthodox Jew who was scathing of Darwinism. So antibiotics were co-discovered by a creationist, an Orthodox Jewish creationist. So once again, medicine does not need evolution either. And back in Australia, there was an interesting article in one of the university teachers magazines, how the biology professor was saying that evolution is so important for biology. We've got to teach more evolution so kids can understand biology better. But then he tells us that we can't get anyone to do the evolution courses because they have no practical value. So what can we say here? The myth that evolution is science is busted. Now, another very important myth that goes around is the Galileo affair. You see, a lot of church people go to water because they're afraid of making supposedly the same mistake the church made with Galileo. And therefore, that's a way of silencing critics of what I call misuse of science, not of real science. But often it intimidates a lot of church leaders. Now, there's an article I wrote on the web not too long ago called Galileo Quadricentennial. which has more information about it. But the key point here is, in fact, it wasn't science versus religion, it was science versus science. Because Arthur Koestler, who is not a Christian, he wrote a book called The Sleepwalkers. That's the centennial of Origin of Species, 1959. And he said there's a powerful body of men whose hostility to Galileo never abated, the Aristotelians at the university. It was a secular scientific establishment that opposed Galileo at first. So science versus science. And a very good quote which can apply to the evolutionists today, that innovation is a twofold threat to academic mediocrities. It endangers their oracular authority and evokes a deeper fear that their whole laboriously constructed intellectual edifice might collapse. I think evolution is another one of these gigantic edifices that is crumbling. And the other thing is, the church itself was open to Galileo and Copernicus. And that's the thing that here's Dr. Cardinal Bellarmine, who is a leading theologian of the church, and he said if there was a real proof that the sun is in the center of the universe and the earth is in the third sphere, and the sun doesn't go around the earth, but the earth around the sun, he said that would have to proceed with great circumspection in explaining the passages of Scripture which appear to teach the contrary. But I don't think there's any such proof, since none has been shown to me. See, one big mistake is to read today's knowledge back 400 years ago. Galileo at the time did not have proof. His biggest proof was supposedly his theory of the tides, which was fallacious. Now, centuries before him, the Venerable Bede in England had the right idea of the tides as being caused by the moon. I'll talk about Bede a bit later, actually, a very great astronomer from his days, as well as being a monk and a church historian and great theologian and translator. But he knew what caused the tides. It was the moon. Galileo got that one wrong. Now, a few centuries later, there's actually good proof, but Galileo did not have it back then. That's the key point. And here's the real opposition comes. Again, it's been known for a long time that a major part of the church's intellectuals are on the side of Galileo, while the clearest opposition to him came from secular ideas. So again, the idea that somehow the church versus science is just not sustained by history. In fact, Galileo was reacting against the false science of his day. But I think there was a mistake made by the church, and it's quite the opposite of what they usually claim. It's in fact the same mistake made by theistic evolutionists and long ages today. They married their theology to the science of the day. But when you do that, you'll be widowed tomorrow. That's what I think is a big mistake of the church, trying to fit evolutionary nonsense into the Bible. It is totally fallacious. It crumbles. And I think this is what happened there. They did the wrong thing. They were influenced by the scientists, the Aristotelians, who wanted to read their own Aristotelian idea into the Bible. Here's one of the passages they quoted here. The world cannot be moved in the book of Psalms. Well, we should know the Psalms are a book of poetry. It's not supposed to be teaching about cosmology here. And I'll prove this very simply because the same psalm, the book of Psalms, has "I shall not be moved," using the same Hebrew word. Does that mean the psalmist was in a straitjacket? No, it's not talking about physical motion. It's talking about God being in control. That the earth and the psalmist will not stray from the path that God had ordained for them. It's nothing to do with physical movement. And another thing is, a lot of it was actually some politics involved as well. Because what Galileo did, in fact, the Pope of the day, well, in fact, he wasn't the Pope at the time, but they were very good friends, and he encouraged Galileo to publish his work. And Galileo did so in the fashion of the day, in the form of dialogues. And what he did is have the dialogue between his view of the sun-centered solar system and the old view, the Aristotelian view of the earth-centered system. And unfortunately, the person representing the earth-centered view was Simplicio, the fool. And unfortunately, the Pope recognized his own arguments in the mouth of the fool. So the Pope felt extremely betrayed by Galileo. Whether it was meant to be a betrayal, I don't know. But in fact, he felt betrayed by this thing. So a lot of it was the papal politics. and Galileo's own foolishness and abrasive nature that led to the problems. I mean, it wasn't that long after this, because even the Jesuits, 30 years after Galileo's death, were teaching Galileo's astronomy to the Chinese astronomers. So really, the church as a whole had no problem with what Galileo was doing. And they even used their own cathedrals. They put a hole in the ceiling so the cathedral was a giant sundial, so they could use that to analyze astronomy. And the church supported this research. So again, the problem with Galileo was not a theological one, but I think a lot of it was politics. A lot of it was from the scientific establishment more than from anything to do with religion. So how do we solve it from a scientific point of view? Well, here's how you do it. This is a speedometer. It shows you going at zero. The car's stopped, right? But hang on, isn't the Earth spinning about 1,000 miles an hour around its axis? How could the speedometer be showing zero? It's because the speedometer measures speed in relation to the ground. The point is, any speed you talk about, you have to specify in relation to what? And the speedometer and the stop signs on the road use the ground as a reference frame. You can choose any reference frame you like. One is not better than another. It happens that to analyze the solar system, it's better to use the sun as the reference frame, because then you have the planets moving in elliptical orbits around the sun. That's what Kepler discovered not too long after Galileo. That would have solved a lot of Galileo's scientific problems, realizing Kepler's idea of the ellipse was the right one, and then Newton developed the laws of motion from that. And all these guys were creationists, They were Bible-believing creationists, all these guys. They were not evolutionists by any means. But the point is, see, it doesn't matter what you discover. You see, there's one newspaper a while back was attacking the Bible for talking about the sun setting and sun rising. Well, that's wrong. But then in the same newspaper, it said, sunset this evening is at 6 p.m. So we do it today. Modern astronomers say sunset and sunrise. It's very hard to say things like, well, the Earth's spinning on its axis and your line of sight to the sun will intersect the horizon at 6 p.m. That's awkward. It makes much more sense to describe have the Earth as your reference frame. And that's what, you try going through a stop sign. Well, you can't have a stop sign because the Earth's going around its axis at 1,000 miles an hour. You try and tell the traffic cop that. Because a stop sign means in relation to the ground. In fact, you can have the reference frame. Another thing, you're going in the car and your kids are fighting in the back. You'd say, sit still. And they say, well, you can't, Mummy, because we're going at 60 miles an hour. Well, see, sit still means in relation to the car, doesn't it? So again, you can choose whatever you like. Or if you're a backseat driver, you think you're going too close to another car in front, you might say pull back. But what does pull back mean? It means you're putting the brake on, so you're going forward less quickly. But when you say pull back, we are using the car in front as your reference frame. And that's what Fred Hoyle said, who's a great astronomer who should have won the Nobel Prize, except he made the mistake of criticizing Darwinism, so he didn't get it. And I'm telling you the truth because, in fact, his discovery made it possible for other people to get, like Fowler, to get the Nobel Prize, and Fowler admits it was Hoyle's insight that led to it. But what he said, it was, in fact, what you have between Galileo and the old idea of Ptolemy was of different reference frames. So all we have is a transformation of coordinates. And he says, the summary is, we cannot say the Copernican theory is right and the Ptolemaic theory wrong in any meaningful physical sense. It's a matter of what reference frame you choose. And the last thing I'll mention with Galileo is this idea that somehow Galileo upset people by dethroning the Earth, removing it from its central position. But in fact, again, that's reading our modern ideas back into Galileo's time. Because in Galileo's time, the center was the worst place to be. Hell was often pictured as in the center of the earth. And the earth itself, at the center, was full of disease and sin because of the fall. But they believed the heavenly bodies away from the center were more and more perfect as you went out. So in fact, Galileo, when he put Earth out from the center, he was promoting it, not demoting it, under his own philosophy. And this also explains another problem he had with the establishment. He discovered sunspots. But the Aristotelian scientists believed the sun was out of the center, so it was perfect. So discovering imperfections of the sun was a threat to the Aristotelian science. Again, there's the idea of science versus religion in this area is just a complete myth. And so I say this idea of a Galileo myth of science versus religion is another myth that has been busted. But it's important to know these because there are just so many people in leadership are intimidated by the Galileo affair so many hundreds of years ago because they don't know their history and don't really know their science either. Now, another myth I want to bust is this idea that the church taught a flat earth. And again, it's very widely believed. In fact, even your president this year said that some of these folks were around when Columbus set sail. They would have been founding members of the Flat Earth Society. They would not have believed the world was round. See, this is a very common myth that Columbus was the only enlightened person in those days who believed the world was round and everyone else believed the world was flat. It's a very, very common myth. But again, it's got no basis in history. And in fact, the church believed in a global earth, and I'll prove this quite conclusively. In fact, all the Christian scholars that have commented on the shape of the earth believe very firmly it was a round earth and not a flat earth. And this was documented in the book called Inventing the Flat Earth. It's about 20 years old now. And even Stephen Jay Gould, an ardent evolutionist, an atheist. Well, actually, not an atheist anymore, he's dead. Okay. But he had high praise for the scholarship in this book, which really demolished the idea of a flat earth belief in the past. See, one thing is quite noticeable is that the medieval kings used an orb as a symbol of their power. See, this is Richard II of England. This is, I think, the earliest real portrait of an English king. See, what they had there is called the globus cruciger. You see, it was very common around medieval Europe. You see, the orb was the symbol of the earth. That's a bit strange, isn't it? A spherical orb is a symbol for a flat earth. No, something's wrong with that picture, isn't it? They knew the earth was round, so they could use an orb, a sphere, a golden sphere to symbolize the round earth. And this huge cross was the size meant the importance of Christ. Christ was the overlord of the entire earth. And holding the orb was symbolizing that he was given power by Christ to rule his particular domain. So it even goes back to the early 8th century, this whole, the orb as a symbol of the kingly power. Very strong proof they believed in a round earth in those days. It just wasn't a dispute there. Now, I mentioned Bede before. Back in the 8th century, this is centuries before Columbus, and he said, we call the earth a globe. Because if all things were included in the outline, the earth's circumference will represent the figure of a perfect globe, and not circular like a shield, but like a ball. How do you get any clearer than that? He believed the earth was shaped like a ball. And Thomas Aquinas, the greatest theologian of the Middle Ages, the physicist proves the earth to be round by one means, the astronomer by another. So again, no dispute. This is the leading theological textbook of the Middle Ages. Explicitly says the earth is a globe. So what about Columbus? The idea of him defeating the flat earth believers, that came from Washington Irving. That was in the 19th century, a writer of fiction who gave a lot of rein to his very fertile imagination with almost nothing to do with real history. And then you've got the 19th century humanists. You have Draper and White. Andrew Dickson White, the founder of Cornell University, explicitly as a secular university, he had to write this book to try to discredit Christians because there was a battle against Darwinism going on at the time. So what better to discredit the opposition to Darwinism than by painting the Christians as flat earthers? By fabricating history, including Columbus. And in fact, what they would do also is a man called Cosmas Indicopleustes. Have you heard of him before? Well, exactly. He was an obscure figure The name means voyager to India. But he was about the only one or two they could find to teach a flat earth, and they claimed he was typical of the church. But in fact, people like Bede and Aquinas and all these other great names of the church affirmed the earth was round, and these guys ignored all that because they had an agenda to try to discredit Christian opposition to Darwinism. Now, this dispute about Columbus was nothing to do with the shape of the earth, but the size of the earth. In fact, Columbus used the wrong mile. There are different lengths of the mile in those days, and Columbus had the wrong one, so he actually underestimated the circumference of the earth. You know, he was trying to find another way to India. And his critics said, well, you haven't got enough food for such a long journey. And they were right. Columbus had underestimated how big the earth was. It was only dumb luck there was a big continent in the way. But to show he didn't know what he was doing, in fact, he called the native inhabitants Indios, which means Indians. He thought he'd reach India. So even today we have his blunder in the name for the Native Americans, calling them the Indians, because Columbus had thought he'd reached India. But in fact, his critics were right. They were right about the size of the earth. But that was the debate, the size and not the shape of the earth. That's a very important thing to remember there. Because as I say, all the educated people in the church and the royalty, they knew perfectly well the earth was round and not flat. And just one last little thing, if any evolutionist calls you a flat earther, you should point out this. The Flat Earth Society is an active organization led by a Virginian man named Daniel Shenton, and he believes in evolution and global warming. So basically, the leading flat earther is one of their fellow evolutionists, not one of us. So really, they've got no basis. He believes the earth is a disc that you can fall off, a true flat earther. But he's an evolutionist, not a creationist. There's a little bit of an irony for you. It's quite amusing to see how, again, the evolutionists are tripped up by their own, by the facts here. That actually undercuts them, not the Bible or creation. So again, here's another myth that's been busted, that the Bible teaches a flat earth. Another busted myth, but it's important to know how to bust it and know some of the facts there.